Welcome to Unlikely Intersections, the podcast where intent, impact, and inquiry inspire our conversations. I'm Dr. Philip Brown with my good friend Dr. Terry Jackson. We have a special guest today. You are at the intersection. The fascinating thing about intersections is that we all go through many intersections daily. The way we navigate these determines the trajectory of our days and of our lives. Terry, we got a really exciting guest today.
Yes, Mr. John Baldoni, consultant, author. I'm going to call him big brother and mentor as well, because we talk probably once a week or so, at least a 10, 15-minute conversation, which I enjoy his conversations. And, you know, he's an extraordinary author. He's written about some extraordinary topics, and we'll get into that. But, John, thank you so very much for taking the time to be with us today.
Well, it's an honor to be on your show with Doc Brown and Doc Terry. Pleased to meet you. I love the theme of the show is intersections. So as I introduce myself, I'll play off on that. So because I think my life has been one of intersections, and now maybe it's kind of a more circular. As Terry said, I'm an executive coach and speaker and teacher and author. And the topic that I've written my last three books on is the topic of grace. And if I look at the arc of my life, while I wasn't aware of it at the time, I was certainly tutored in the spirit of grace by the example of my parents. My father was a small town family practitioner. My mother was active in community affairs and elected office as well, and active in ecumenical affairs and church things. And both my parents lived lives of service. I was educated by the Jesuits, where I learned another form of grace. I don't know how much rubbed off on me as a teenager, but maybe a little bit in college. So I pursued that. My original bent was creative, and so I went to film school in London after graduating in Georgetown. And then I migrated to Los Angeles, Southern California, where I met my wife. And I decided somewhere along the line, I wasn't really a natural storyteller. In other words, an invented storyteller. I was better at telling other people's story. And I was really good at promoting other people. So that I migrated to corporate communications, where I eventually became a speechwriter. And I was writing for very senior executives. And something I always like to tell folks is that the way we frame leadership, certainly in the corporate sector now, is actually a fad. I don't mean leadership itself is, but the topic of leadership. And as I always go back to my high school years and college years, I don't think I ever recall hearing the word leadership. I was taught it, and I was shown it, and I saw the examples of it, but it wasn't something that was widely commerce. Today, you can do a PhD in leadership studies, which is great. But what I mean by that is all the principles were there, but we didn't frame it as something that could be taught unless you were in the military. That's really the only place that seemingly taught leadership as we know it. And so I was writing speeches, and I was asked by senior leaders to write on leadership, and I was doing that. And I said, hey, I'd rather be saying that myself. Well, if you're a speechwriter, what's your hallmark? Anonymity. You're not the person that gets on stage. So I went back to school and did a master's. And then I published my first book and met Marshall Goldsmith decades ago. And Marshall said to me, Marshall Goldsmith is a famous coach, probably the real founder of modern coaching the way it is, and said, you ought to be a coach. And so I thought, oh, okay. And then eventually I did and became certified and all those other kinds of things. But I pursued my writing the same time. So what I do today is I write, I teach, and I coach. And I do that. But my passion today is focusing on the good in life and how it affects us and how we can make a better world through creating community and connection. So that's me in a nutshell. So,
that's awesome. And of course that was something new about the speech writing for me. Didn't know that, but the topic of leadership, it's very interesting because every time we turn around, there's a new adjective that's put in front of leadership, right? Somebody creating their own framework of what a leader should have. And in my view, a leader should encompass all of the adjectives that are put before it, right? It's just a matter of which hat you need to put on: the servant leader, the transformation leader, the whatever, the compassionate leader, right? But grace is a very interesting topic. And so what made you write about grace?
Well, I had written about grace before, and I always tell this story. And it was a book I wrote 20 years ago, or not 20 years ago, 15 years ago. Um, and it was in a story that I had heard. Well, it was on national news, and it was in the wake of a shooting. Of course, it's always a shooting, but this was the one in an Amish community. And I remember the grandfather speaking to the media. And of course, the Amish do not traditionally speak to the media, but he did. He had two grandchildren slain on that, two granddaughters slain in that terrible shooting. And he went on camera. He said, "We want the family of the shooter to know that we bear him no malice." And I was like, where does that come from? And we've seen that again and again and again. People who have been wronged exhibit grace. So it led me to think about it. And then and we live in very divisive times like now. And I was in 2018 or something, and I was fed up with, what I like to call anti-social media. And I said, I could write it. I could write a screed, but who cares? So how about focusing on the antidote to the hatred and divisiveness in our culture? That, of course, is grace. And all of us have been exposed to grace in one form or another, some from a faith-based community, all of us by example. And as I researched grace, I found that it is probably a universal trait. We're wired that, in the sense that we are wired to take care of one another, at least in family units, tribal units, whatever, community. And as I explored grace, I came up with a little acronym, which I did in my first book, Grace, A Leader's Guide to a Better Us. Said grace is, G is for generosity, respect, and compassion. And the two things, when I apply grace to leadership, leaders do the A, which is act, and the E, energize the organization. So that book came out in 2019, and it got a lot of positive play, but it didn't sell at all. And a friend and I was bemoaning that to someone in the business, and they said, "Well, that's obvious. It's a nice to have, but it's not want to have." So come the COVID, people started talking about the need for grace, because we were in isolation, and I had time to think about other things in our lives. And so it led me to, continue to explore the topic. And I did a little book, which is sort of half poetry, but a series of reflections. I call Grace Notes. And it's about leading in an upside down world. It's just reflections on what leaders need to do in times of crisis. And talked about empathy and compassion and resilience and rebuilding and all the things we were going through. But I had I wanted to give grace something a little stronger. And so I thought I used the word muscle. And our colleague, C.B. Bowman, said, grace under pressure.
Yes.
Well, that's a phrase that's been around for quite some time. As a matter of fact, it's attributed to Hemingway. He wrote it in a letter to Dorothy Parker, who was a writer, author, and then it was discovered or picked up by Ted Sorensen when he was helping John Kennedy write his book Profiles in Courage. And to both Kennedy and to Hemingway, grace under pressure meant that courage exerted and keeping it together when things are flying apart. And so that's the theme of this book, is how do you use grace when times call for it? And so the thesis of the book are three things I discuss. And that's when times of crisis and change, what do leaders do? Well, they take care of their people, they take care of themselves, and they prepare for the future. Now, that's not rocket science, and but my twist on it is that they do it with the spirit of grace. So what do I mean by that? Caring, commitment, courage, compassion. And why? To help build connection, which in turn builds community. So that's the origin of my journey into grace.
So you said something that kind of captured my imagination a little bit. I hope we can explore it maybe. Is you talked about the leader taking care of themselves, basically extending grace to oneself. What does that look like?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's the weakest part of the book. Well, actually not the weakest part of the book, but it's actually not what I meant. Was it's the part that leaders forget.
Yes.
It's because, as you gentlemen both know, that leadership is outward directed, because it's enabling others and putting them in positions to succeed. So leaders overlook themselves. And so part of that is that what we're suffering from, and you would know this, Doc, from your journeys in medicine and surgery, burnout. People, you can't be on all the time. And as we know, if we are always on and we work in extremis all the time, we become less effective. I like to use the word, but the analogy is you become an awake drunk. You're not high, but you're not effective. And so it's about taking care of yourself, which is diet and exercise, but reflection, reading, things like that. But I'm glad you mentioned showing grace to yourself, Doc, because that's essential. Grace to oneself, in other words, I'm worthy. I have something to offer. I can do something, enables us to reach out toward other people. And that enabling someone else is maybe just occupying space to them. One of the inspirational figures that I have written about and actually met is Father Greg Boyle, who founded Homeboy Industries in East LA. It's the largest gang intervention program in the world. And what he does is provide employment for people who have given up the gang life. What it is essentially what he's doing is, why do these young people join gangs? Well, they come from disadvantaged homes. I mean, disadvantaged homes could mean no parents. So what are they looking for? Well, they're looking for community. So the idea of a gang offers them connection. All right. So what Father G, as he's called, created in Homeboy is actually a community where they can belong. And when he gave an interview years ago. It was on Fresh Air, Terry Gross's great show. He talked about, people say, well, why don't they just lift themselves up by their bootstraps? He goes, what boots, what straps? He said, I grew up in an environment, an intact family, Irish Catholic. He said, I couldn't have failed if I tried. And he said, and so look at the other side. So when we talk about, but the thing about connection is the opposite of what Terry and I do as executive coaches, because we're hired to work with people, and part of that is giving advice. Well, when you're making connections with people, you simply reach out to them, meet them where they are, share space with them. That costs nothing. And rather than preach at them, how about listening first? And then we spark a conversation. And so that's that. And that from there, you build a kind of community of people who are willing to help other folks. And I believe the workforce, and I think that's what we're looking for. Part of this great resignation, which is still going on, even though it's labeled lots of other things. I think I interviewed a gentleman the other day on my show, Jim Harder, who's got a new book of the Gallup organization called Culture Shock. He calls the shuffling of work, he said, it's not the great resignation, it's the great reshuffling, because people are not becoming unemployed. They're going to someplace else. But imagine if you created a workplace where people did not want to leave and would want to be there because they feel appreciated and contributed. And that's and that's part of a bedrock of community.
See, that's the great challenge, John. As writers, as authors, and we create these frameworks. We create what sounds good on paper. We create work that make people feel good as they read. But what's difficult about it is the actual application, right? In the workplace, right? You know, let's take one of my books, Transformational Thinking. Right? When pressure happens, people normally reflect back to what they know. So they're not saying, well, I'm going to be a transformational thinker because I'm under a little bit of pressure at this time and let me see how I can do something different, right? That doesn't happen. How do we get people to understand and to actually begin to use the tools that we create when they are under pressure? Because it seems like everything goes out the window. It's like Mike Tyson said, everybody has a plan till somebody hits them in the face, right?
Right. Well, that's where grace comes in. And so one of the themes of the book, and the research I've done, and I've borrowed from our colleague, Sharon Melnick, who's a clinical psychologist, and she's written a couple of books on the topic of resilience, is learning to adapt. And I've had the experience of interviewing special forces people, and they train and train and train. And Doc, you would know this too from your surgery experience, so that when you get into situations of extremists, be it combat or high pressure, your training takes over, and then you are able to cooperate in the moment. And I just did a fascinating interview yesterday with Sally Jenkins, who has a brand new book out called The Right Call. And Sally is a longtime sports writer and author, and works for the Washington Post. And she's wrote the biography of Pat Summitt, the former legendary coach of women's basketball at Tennessee. But she's been exploring the topic of what does it mean to be a great athlete? And she said, you know what, great athletes, it comes down to, they're not extraordinary in the moment. They are ordinary for them because they have the talent, yes, but they've so honed their skills that they call upon them when times are necessary. And even well-trained athletes can get in trouble like this. And she was citing the example of a young man who was playing in the French Open, the finals against Djokovic. And this young man was totally overwhelmed by the moment, and he started cramping up. Well, that was a physiological reaction, and you would know that better than I would, Doc Brown, because the blood flow wasn't going there, because he was just, overwhelmed, and he wasn't, I don't know, breathing correctly or whatever, but he just sort of fell apart in the moment. I'm sure he will come back from that. He will learn from that, but he was letting, the circumstance overcome him, and it affected his physiology. So how do we cope with that? And so it's learning that what are the triggers? What are my stress points? And when I uncover them, what will I do? And we train ourselves for them. And so there's simple things to do, like a pause, just don't speak, go out, breathing exercises, of course, yoga helps us do this, taking a walk. I mean, these are just simple things. But I think the moment comes from thinking about and preparing for it. And this is what I work in my coaching practice, is that when a stressor is going to happen, how are you going to react? So, the first thing is maybe just don't react immediately. Take a pause, take a breath, then say something. And so those are the kind of little things. But overall, when everything's flying apart, as we saw during COVID, during the lockdown, people rose to the occasion. And part of that is, asking for help. And another person I interviewed was Julia Borstein, whose book is When Women Lead. And she did some research on the fact that women leaders in organizations during the lockdown often did better than male leaders. Why? Because women leaders were not afraid to ask for help. We men, we don't even ask for directions. But opening yourself up, being humble, being vulnerable, it's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. And basically what you're doing is it's not about me, it's about me enabling us to survive. So that's a long-winded answer, I think, Terry, to what you're saying.
Yeah, great example.
Yeah. It kind of, as you were going through this whole thing, it kind of reminded me of a story from my career. I can so vividly remember it was late one night. We were in the operating room about to do a ruptured aneurysm, and aorta is the largest blood vessel in the body. If it ruptures, the chance of dying from that is somewhere over 80%. And if you happen to get to the hospital alive, it's about 50-50. And we're getting ready to do this operation. Anesthesia is getting ready to put the patient to sleep. And when that happens, usually it sort of takes away the adrenaline rush that the patient has that's keeping them alive. Basically, when they get anesthetized, that goes away. And they often arrest right on the table. And I was looking around the room as anesthesia was doing their prep, and we were ready, and I realized that the team was all over the place. Everybody was hustling around, well-intentioned, but it was chaos. And so we did the equivalent of a timeout. I mean, we do timeouts routinely for surgery and go through what we're going to do and all the basics of this given checklist. But I did a different kind of timeout. I got everybody's attention, and I said, okay, I want you to just hear me real quick. I said, in about a minute, the patient's going to die. And we will have about 2 minutes for everybody to do their job, do it well. And when we all do it well, then we'll be back in the game. The patient's going to come back, and we'll have a chance to save his life. Took about 30 seconds. The whole room got quiet. They put the patient to sleep. As expected, he arrested. We did our thing, and I ended up seeing that patient for years in follow-up in the office. And it was a thing that happened because everybody knew what they really needed to do. They were just lost in the fog at first, right? And they just needed a brief callback, and they needed to be reminded of some really essential, basic functions. And what I feel like happened there is a creation of that sense of community that you've been talking about, right? Like everybody had a role. It was really important. It was a purpose-driven thing, which, that unified purpose always tends to get people into a sense of community. But I wanted to explore on the back end of that story and on your comments. Earlier you had talked about, the new work community, right? How do you make it where people do feel appreciated, do feel like they're part of that community? What does that take in 2023 if you're the leader? What does it take to create that kind of community?
So you tell that story, and I'm supposed to come back just straight and say, give some leadership pablum. Thanks a lot, Doc. I appreciate you throwing me under the bus.
Well, the truth is, what you say will probably be more useful. So,
that's great. Well, actually, it comes down to what our friend Chester Elton teaches, which is appreciation. Mm-hmm. And it costs nothing, but it's a discipline for a leader to let people know how much they are appreciated. So, for example, in your example, Doc, had you gone around to each person afterward and said, you really pulled it together, that was exemplary, I appreciate that. That type of thing, recognizing people for what they have done. Also being available to them to listen to them, what they want to say, not necessarily in the moment of appreciation, but letting that know that your door is open. You are willing to have a conversation. We often, Terry and I know, coach, talk about coaching, enabling executives to coach their employees and set up regular coaching sessions, which can be partly business, but also just about the development of the individual. What do you want to do? Where do you see yourself? Where do you need to go? Those types of things, or just life conversations. And I think more and more we're getting into the life experiences. Certainly since COVID, I think people are more open talking about their circumstance at home, young children, elder care, maybe a pending divorce or something like that, providing whatever, meeting people where they are and what they want to share. Now, everybody doesn't want to share their personal story, and that's fine. But I think letting yourself know, letting individuals know that you are there to care. And I once had the privilege of, interviewed, but I got to know a gentleman, Skip LaFoe, who was essentially the president. Well, he was the president of Saturn Corporation, which was GM's startup venture for vehicles a couple decades ago. And Skip was a magnetic leader. And wherever he would go, he drew people to them. Why? Because they sensed, and this was in the shop floor as well as the boardroom, and because they knew that Skip cared about them, he listened to them. And that's, there's a gift that leaders have, is when they isolate on an individual, they make you or the group that you're with feel like you're the most important people in the world. And I think, going back to your story, Doc, I think that that's what you tapped into when you did that time out. You laid the stakes on the table and you looked at each person and you said, you have a job to do. And implicitly you said, I trust you. And they did it. They came through for you, as they often will. And that's how you show appreciation, but it's how you build that connection toward others.
Yeah, what a great analysis. It kind of reminds me, one of the other things that leads up to moments like that is something that also kind of guided my practice over the years, which was, during a case, a lot of times I would open up the dialogue amongst the team to ask for ideas, right? And it's a funny paradox, because the thing I always taught my residents is that I never think during a case, right? Like, I already know the range of possibilities before I ever go in there. And there's no, like, let's think through this that really happens during an operation, right? It's all within a set range of possibilities, and there are multiple solutions for every possibility. But I always like to ask the team, if they had any ideas, or if something didn't go real smoothly, I'd say, anybody have any ideas? And if they came up with one, which they almost always did, even if I thought it might not be the most efficient, if it was at least a way that I thought it would work and give the same outcome, I always just tried it that way. And what that created over time was that when you did actually get into a situation that, 1 or 2% of the cases where something truly was unexpected and you really needed help, or if you needed somebody to go above and beyond for whatever reason, maybe something happened during the case and the urgency ticked up. What amazed me all along the way is how people rallied at that point, right? Because we'd already created this environment of safety. They knew that it was a safe space, that I would listen to them. And it was 100% successful in folks always being willing to make suggestions when it was needed. And I have no doubt that over the course of all the years I did that, it saved people's lives because of their ideas. And in those cases, it was always, I've always been a one for recognition in terms of, if somebody does something, whether it's something kind or whether it's something brilliant or whatever, to just, and in that team setting, the way I would usually do it would be public praise for most of them, although everyone doesn't like that. You have to be careful. But that building process starts much earlier than in the moment of crisis. And I think it ties to your theme of grace as well. So as you're building that over time, as you're building an environment as a leader, a graceful environment over time, what does that look like?
Well, it's the commitment to doing it. And you made it safe for people to contribute, but many surgeons or leaders, executives, are fearful of accepting input from other people because their perception is it will make them look weak. Well, and actually the opposite, as you have just shown through the stories, is the untrue. And so there has to be this commitment to willingly call it vulnerability, call it humility, but the ability to ask for help, but maybe not just help, but ask for advice. And so that's a leadership attribute. Tell me what you think, especially with junior people. Terry and I work on mentoring a lot. And thank you, Terry, for referring me as your mentor. I am honored by that. But there's something we call reverse mentoring, which is what young people can do for us. Yes. Certainly for technology. Yes. I always joke that said, if I'm going to hire someone in technology, they better not be over 15 years old. But no, seriously, young people are much more adept and comfortable with technology than certainly this oldster is. And so that's a form of opening a dialogue. They can be my troubleshooter that way, but also they have things to share. And we in turn have much to share with us, because if we get to a certain age and we've paid attention, we have a bit of wisdom, and it's nice to share that wisdom. But I think getting back to your question, Doc Brown, is that you need to make a conscious decision that I welcome input from other people, make it safe for people to contribute, and actually make it almost a job expectation. If you're on my team, I want to hear from you. And there's a great story that goes back to the origins, I think, the Second World War, and it was General Marshall, who was the chief of staff of the U.S. Army, equivalent of Joint Chiefs of Staff in our time, but ran the military, the Army. And he had a lot of folks around him, and they were mobilizing for something. I don't think it was actually war effort, but it was part of the war effort, but I don't think war had been declared. But he had asked his aides to come in and present him with some plans and all this kind of stuff. And the end of the day, whatever, and he went through them, and he looked at them, and they were all feeling kind of chuffed and pretty pleased with themselves because they had come up with some good things and all that. And he said, gentlemen, I'm extremely disappointed in each of you. And their faces just dropped. Well, what did we do? He said, not one of you has disagreed with me. So what am I doing with you? So, in other words, talk back. And so I think we need that. I want to hear contrary points of view. I may not agree with you. I may not take that point of view, but I want to hear an alternate point of view, or something better, or, it can be a reinforcement, but I just don't want reinforcement. I want your best efforts. So.
That's a whole cultural change. I can remember entering the corporate setting for the first time, and the fear of really saying what's on your mind because of someone trying to hold that against you, right? So now we're talking 20, 30 years later, we are saying, hey, we really want your input. you know, and so people are skeptical, of that, given, how certain people hold things against them, and it could impact them from a promotion perspective, from a raise perspective. So, we understand that it takes time. One of the things I used to ask my team to do in corporate is, after every meeting, we had a Monday morning meeting every Monday, and say, hey, how can I serve you better? What can I do better to be a better leader or a better manager? What knowledge do I need to acquire? Initially, of course, people were skeptical, and I'm not going to tell this guy what he needs to do because, I'm going to see it later when we sit down and an appraisal. But ultimately, they understood that I was genuine about that. And I think the language, of course, is important because I always said none of these people worked for me. They all worked with me. We were all in this, and I was only as good as they were. When they succeeded, I succeeded. So to really create that type of culture, and I think that's what you're talking about when you talk about grace, right? That kind of culture where we're just human beings trying to achieve the same objective versus the title of whatever the titles may be in those departments. Sometimes the titles really kind of set that whole superior inferiority kind of complex. So,
without question.
Yes, how do we make the shift in our world to remove the titles, to understand that even though we might be in a organization with 300,000 people, that we are here to achieve the same goal, and the titles really don't matter if the goals are not met?
Well, it comes down to, connection. And making it. And now, if you're running a large corporation, 300,000, you're not going to be able to do that. You're not going to touch everybody. But let's take the example of someone we both know, Alan Mulally. Alan Mulally was a president of Boeing Aircraft and then became CEO of Ford Motor Company. And Alan was always, he had two themes: love your people and serve your people. And he radiated that. And he had these, like you had these weekly meetings called the BPR, a business plan review, where he collected all the chief people of different functions in the organization, all got together in the same room and did essentially report outs. But more importantly, it was also created that opportunity for people to share ideas. And, Alan he was functioned as the cheerleader, and someone like Terry, you'd have a problem and they go, well, who in this room can help Terry do this? So you're creating that. And once you do it at that level, then the expectation, and it did happen, is that you would create that kind of facilitation of help and service throughout the organization. And I believe then it starts in a micro level, creating a culture of service within an organization, which is bedrock to community. So we ask ourselves, a one-on-one, how can I be a better colleague? And you define what it means to be better, but how can I help Doc do his job better? How can I help you do your job? It's not meddling, it's just being available, being there to facilitate. And in return, people will help you. So you create that cooperation. I mean, that's what good teams do. And I remember talking to Sally Jenkins just yesterday. She goes, and she quoted Pat Summitt, who is the great coach of Tennessee. And she said, when teams are really succeeding, you can hear it. She said, and Sally said, well, what do you mean hear it? And she goes, well, there's this kind of a sound, there's an atmosphere, whatever it was. She said, the players say, I have your back. That is community. I have your back. And when that permeates an organization, people feel more open about it. But the leader has to give permission, because if I just walk in as you did in the first day, whatever, and say, I want you to give me straight feedback and tell me what's going on, people are not going to do that. You have to demonstrate. You have to be careful and create conditions where they feel safe to do that. And it's work. It's really hard work. So
powerful there. Now, as we've been talking about this concept of grace and creating a culture that basically is all about gracefulness, it almost sounds as if once attained, this environment is basically an immunization against the whole environment of unsafe interactions, right? Like, so, we talked about creating this safe to speak type culture. Would you say that a culture of grace basically immunizes you against that as a team?
I hadn't thought about that, but I wish you would have shared that with me 6 months ago when I was finalizing the book. But no, but I think that is very, very much so. But it's an immunization that has to be actively worked upon.
Yes.
And here's what happens in organizations. Let's say they have a culture of grace and service, and they have a leader who facilitates this. And so, and then a person like Doc Brown retires, and he's replaced by a person who is not like Doc Brown, and the culture falls apart. And it shouldn't, but it does, because we liked it the way Doc Brown ran it, but we don't like it the way this new guy runs it. And so that's where grace is that active process, and it's not owned by the leader by any means. It's all of us. Grace is given to us, no strings attached, but to make it safe to act with care and compassion needs to be practiced on a regular basis, and certainly within a corporate environment has to be kind of blessed at the top, if you will. Although I don't want to say that if you have a tyrannical leader, there cannot be grace in an organization shown by other people, because there is. We see that. So each of us do what we can do. But when we talk about culture, that has to be reinforced at the top. And so, this is the way we do things in our organization. We set standards of expectations for behavior, how we interact with one another. That's the way you reinforce it. So,
kind of gets at the whole concept of succession and transition, right? Like, so if you had advice around, and you started it there, but more advice around how exactly you carry that tradition over across various leaders as they get replaced, either through departure or attrition of any other kind, what would that look like in an organization?
well, you have the best person for the job at that time, whatever it demands. But ideally, the best of the culture will continue to be nurtured and thrive. At the same time, each leader is entitled to put their own stamp on the organization in the sense of doing things differently, because circumstances will dictate it. Too often, I mean, if you're looking at cloning people, that's not good scientific practice. So you have to enable leaders to have the flex and the ability to be themselves, but you want them to be respectful of the culture and what has occurred. And so that would happen during the recruitment process, I think. And if you're hiring from the outside, but if it's an internal hire, then that person would, if they're already living the culture, then that's not going to be an issue. But you raise a good question, Doc. It's not an easy answer, and but it's something to be considered with every succession plan. So,
Well, John, I think we've done it. I tell you, you've given me a lot to think about, and I feel like I've learned a whole lot. I certainly believe our listeners and our viewers will have enjoyed this a whole bunch. If folks want to catch our whole series, it's unlikelyintersection.com or on YouTube, Unlikely Intersections. You can find me at docphilipbrown.com. Terry?
You can find me at LinkedIn, Terry Jackson, PhD. You can find me on, Facebook. And John, if someone is interested in executive coaching, leadership development, learning more about your book, you going out and speaking to an organization, how can they reach you?
The best place is my website, johnbaldoni.com, and my contact information is there, as well as a lot of resources. I write regularly for Forbes.com and SmartBrief, and all of those are collected in my blog site, and there's a lot of videos. It's johnbaldoniblog.com, and there's tons of materials there, including infographics. And my book, Grace Under Pressure, Leading Through Change and Crisis, is available wherever good books are sold, as well as on Amazon. So thank you.
All right, so this is the culmination of the whole hour, is that one pearl of wisdom you'd like to leave our listeners with. If you had to distill it down to one concept, John, what would you leave everybody with?
Well, focus on better. What I mean, you define what better means, and how can I be a better colleague, a better friend, a better spouse, and act on that and go with grace.
Thank you, John. And thank you, listeners. We'll see you at the next intersection.